I want to tell you something I have hesitated to say for years, not because I thought it was untrue. I knew it was true. I hesitated because I was afraid of how it would sound paranoid, perhaps, or sensational, or too convenient a claim from a man whose entire ministry depends on people believing the demonic is real. But I have seen enough now that I no longer have the luxury of caution, and so I will say it plainly. There is a reason you cannot stay awake during the most sacred hour of your week. There is a reason the yawning begins precisely when the priest elevates the host. There is a reason the mind wanders, the eyes grow heavy, the attention dissolves, not when you were watching television for 3 hours, not when you were scrolling through your phone before bed, but at the exact moment when, if the faith is true, the Son of God descends to an altar 12 feet in front of you. I am not saying every yawn is demonic. I am not saying you are oppressed or harassed or under spiritual attack because you nodded off during the homily last Sunday. That is not the claim. The claim is more precise and more serious than that. The claim is this: the enemy has a documented, theologically cataloged, pastorally observed aversion to the sacred. He cannot be neutral in the presence of the Eucharist. He cannot simply wait it out. And because he cannot wait it out, he works on you in ways so natural, so physical, so ordinary seeming that you will explain it away before you finish reading this sentence. The question the entire history of the Church's exorcism ministry forces you to confront is whether you are willing for 1 hour to fight back. Stay with me. What I am about to tell you is something most priests will never say publicly, not because they think it is false, but because the seminary formation of the last 50 years trained them to speak about spiritual warfare in metaphors. And what I have seen in my ministry is not a metaphor. Subscribe. Because the work I am describing here is the work of a lifetime, and someone has to speak it plainly, and I am going to keep speaking it for as long as God gives me breath. My name is Chad Ripperger. I am a Catholic priest, ordained in the traditional rite, Thomistic philosopher by training, and one of the very few priests in the Western world who holds a formal ecclesiastical mandate to perform the solemn rite of exorcism as codified in the Roman ritual of 1614. I did not seek this ministry. I studied metaphysics. I studied the nature of the soul. I read St. Thomas Aquinas at his writing desk in Naples, in the Summa Theologiae, working through the angels and their properties with the precision of a man who had seen them, and I wanted that kind of intellectual rigor about the supernatural. But the Church has a way of placing you where she needs you, not where you imagined yourself. The bishop called, a case was referred. And then I stood in a room where what I had read in the Summa was no longer abstract, and nothing in any classroom had prepared me for what it was to stand in front of it. I entered seminary with a love for philosophy, and I spent those years building the intellectual architecture that would eventually make sense of what I was going to see. Aquinas, the Fathers, the spiritual directors of the great saints. The tradition of Pseudo-Dionysius on the celestial hierarchy, the classification of angelic orders, the nature of angelic intellect, the mechanics of how a fallen angel operates in the material world. I was building a map. I did not know yet that I was going to need it in a very practical way. The first case I worked changed that, not because of anything dramatic, because of one specific thing. One thing that I had read about in the tradition that I had treated as a theological category that I suddenly watched happen in front of me. And from that moment, I understood that the tradition was not describing the past, it was describing the present. It had always been describing the present. We simply stopped reading it. The subject of this video is something smaller than possession. It is something closer to home. It is something happening to Catholics in the pews every Sunday in parishes all over the English-speaking world, and no one is calling it what it is. The theological category is acedia. The pastoral category is what I have called in my teaching a demonic aversion to the sacred. The experiential category, the one that will make most people close this tab, is yawning. Open-mouthed, involuntary, relentless yawning specifically concentrated during the Mass. Specifically concentrated in the cases I have observed and in the pattern documented in the Church's mystical tradition around the moment of the consecration. Around the moment when the priest holds the host above the paten, speaks the words of institution, and what was bread becomes, if the Catholic faith is true, if 2,000 years of martyrs and theologians and saints were not collectively diluted, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ. I am going to tell you what the tradition says about that moment and what happens to a soul and to the enemy operating near a soul when it occurs. I am going to tell you what I have observed in deliverance ministry about the specific pattern of distraction and drowsiness that concentrates itself around sacred acts. I am going to give you the theological framework that makes sense of it. I am not going to pretend the enemy is lurking behind every yawn. What I am going to do is give you the tools to tell the difference. And I am going to ask you a question at the end that I think you already know the answer to. Stay with me. Now, the composite case. I will describe, as I always do, a pattern I have observed across multiple individuals over the course of years. No name, no location. No identifying detail that would allow you to connect this to any specific person. That is not evasion, that is fidelity to the confidence of the confessional and the pastoral relationship. But the pattern is real, and I have seen it enough times to speak of it with precision. A man in his late 40s, Catholic, practicing by most external measures, Sunday Mass, occasional confession, the rosary with some regularity. He came to me not because he was screaming in a room or throwing furniture. He came because something was happening at Mass that he could no longer explain or dismiss. He would arrive at the church awake. He had slept well. He was not medicated. He was not ill. He would sit in the pew, the old wooden pew of a church built in 1892, the votive candles burning in the side chapel to Our Lady, the bronze crucifix above the high altar catching the light the way it had caught it for 100 years, and he would feel fine. Alert, ready, he would follow the introit, the Kyrie, the Gloria, the Collect. He would listen to the readings. And then, with the precision of a clock at the offertory, as the priest began the preparation of the gifts, the heaviness would begin. Not tiredness exactly, something more specific than that. A weight in the eyelids, a pulling, a cotton thickness behind the eyes. By the time the preface began, the Sanctus, the beginning of the canon, the weight was almost unbearable. And at the consecration, at the moment of elevation, he would be fighting with everything he had just to keep his eyes open. And then it would lift, not gradually, abruptly. After the communion, sometimes during the distribution, the heaviness was simply gone. He would drive home completely alert, completely normal, wondering what had happened. I will not give you the full detail of what we discovered in the course of working with him, because that is his spiritual business before God. What I will tell you is that when I began to ask him about the history, about the family line, about the specific sins that had been left unconfessed over years, a pattern emerged that I have seen before. Not something monstrous, not Satanism or blood pacts, something quieter and more common. Habitual grave sin carried for years without confession. A specific, unconfessed act, decades old, that had never been brought to the sacrament. And in that gap, in the space between the soul and its Redeemer, something had found a foothold. Not possession, not even oppression in the full sense. What the tradition calls something closer to subjugation in a specific faculty, the faculty of attention, the faculty of will as it directed the intellect toward the sacred. The enemy did not need to scream. He needed only to make the man sleep. Silence at the consecration. Not the silence of God, the silence of something that could not afford to let this man pay attention to what was happening on that altar. I want to apply the tradition now to what I have just described, and to do that I need to go back to St. Thomas Aquinas, who wrote in the Summa Theologiae, in the Prima Pars, in questions 50 through 64, on the nature of angels and the nature of their fall. Aquinas is precise about what happens when an angelic intellect refuses God. The intelligence is not destroyed. It is not diminished. An angel is a pure intellect, and the fall does not corrupt that intellect in its natural operations. What is destroyed is charity, the right ordering of that intellect toward its proper end. What remains is an angelic intelligence of enormous power, operating in full possession of its natural faculties, with a will that is permanently and irrevocably chosen not to serve. This is why the demonic is never stupid, never clumsy, never imprecise. When a fallen angel decides to prevent a soul from worshiping, it does not make the ceiling fall in. It makes the soul drowsy. It makes the mind wander to the grocery list, to the argument had with a spouse on Thursday, to the song heard in the parking lot driving to church. It works within the natural operations of a distracted human body, and it amplifies them, directs them, concentrates them at the specific moment when the soul is closest to the grace it needs. Because the fallen angel knows, with its angelic intelligence, exactly what happens at the consecration. It knows what is on that altar. It has reacted to that reality since 33 AD. And it has been working to keep human souls away from that altar since the first Mass. Pseudo-Dionysius, writing in the Celestial Hierarchy in the late 5th or early 6th century, described the angelic orders in terms of their proximity to the divine light and their capacity for communion with it. The fallen orders retain their natural hierarchical position in terms of intelligence and power. What they have lost is participation in that light. And so they exist in a state that can only be described as an absolute aversion to it. Not indifference, aversion, active, operational, unchangeable aversion to the sacred. The first letter of Peter, chapter 5, verse 8, puts it this way: "Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. Lions do not wander aimlessly. They are specific. They are patient. They are watching for the moment when the prey is most available and least defended." St. John Vianney, the Cure d'Ars, who was born in 1786 and died on 4 August 1859, after 41 years as parish priest of a village he transformed from spiritual ruin into a place of pilgrimage for hundreds of thousands of Catholics from all over Europe, documented his encounters with what he called Le Grappin, the claw, the demon that harassed him physically for decades. Vianney understood this harassment as precisely targeted. It intensified before the days when the most sinners came to his confessional. It concentrated itself on his rest, on his sleep, on his physical capacity to get up and begin the 12-hour days in the confessional box. The enemy was not attacking him randomly. He was attacking the specific instrument through which the most souls were being rescued from him. The brass holy water font outside Vianney's sacristy was refilled every morning, and the saint used it every time he entered the sanctuary, not as ritual, but as weapon. Padre Pio, born Francesco Forgione in 1887 and bearing the stigmata from 20 September 1918 until his death in 1968, described physical assaults by the demonic blows he received in his cell, disturbances that concentrated themselves around his preparation for Mass. His biographers documented that the violence increased specifically around the liturgical act, not around his preaching, not around his pastoral work, around the Mass. This is the pattern. The enemy knows what the Mass is. The enemy's reaction to the Eucharist is not theological speculation. It is observed, documented, cataloged across 2,000 years of the Church's mystical tradition. Dr. Richard Gallagher, a psychiatrist trained at Columbia and affiliated with Yale, has stated publicly that he has witnessed cases that cannot be explained by any psychiatric or neurological mechanism he was trained to apply. One of the consistent features he has documented is a specific involuntary reaction in subjects under possession to the consecrated host, a reaction that occurs whether or not the subject knows the host is present, not to an unconsecrated wafer, to the consecrated host, because what they are reacting to is not the object, it is the person within it. Now, I want to be precise about the classification of what I am describing, because the tradition is precise about this, and I have no interest in being imprecise. What I described in that composite case is not possession. Full possession, the possession described in the Roman ritual of exorcism of 1614, is the rarest form of demonic activity. It is the form that gets filmed. It is the form that generates television documentaries. It is not the form that is most dangerous to the average Catholic sitting in a pew in 2026. The forms most dangerous to the average Catholic are much quieter. Temptation is universal. Every soul that has ever lived has been subject to temptation from an external source. That is not a sign of spiritual failure. It is the condition of life in a fallen world. Oppression is external harassment, physical difficulties, persistent misfortune, a heaviness in certain places or at certain times, a concentration of difficulty around spiritual practice. More common than most Catholics realize, and the tradition has resources for addressing it. Obsession is different. It is persistent mental assault, a repetitive intrusion of thoughts that the person does not want and cannot seem to dismiss by normal means, often targeted at the spiritual life, often intensifying around prayer and the sacraments. Infestation is attached to a place or an object, a house with a history, an object brought in from certain contexts. I have addressed this in other places and will not develop it here. Subjugation is the progressive surrender of the will through habitual grave sin, not a single act, a habit, a pattern. A years-long choice that has thinned the soul's spiritual protection to the point where specific faculties, specific aspects of the interior life are particularly accessible. Possession, the full form, is the rarest. What most Catholics encounter, if they encounter anything at all, is somewhere in that earlier part of the spectrum. And what I am describing in the context of Mass attendance, in the context of that specific drowsiness at the consecration, is a form of oppression or obsession that is specifically targeted. Specifically targeted at the one act that, if done worthily and attentively, is the single most powerful source of grace available to a human being on this earth. The 4 entry doors matter here, and I want to name them because the composite case I described and the dozens like it that I have worked with over the years almost always trace back through one or more of these 4. The first is occult contact, and I mean this broadly. Not merely formal Satanism, not merely Aleister Crowley and black masses. Ouija boards, used at a slumber party 30 years ago. Tarot cards, consulted once or twice as entertainment. Horoscopes, followed with something approaching belief. Seances, Wiccan practices. Certain forms of meditation that explicitly invoke entities by name, certain uses of yoga that go beyond physical exercise into the invocation of spiritual forces associated with non-Christian religious systems. The Church's teaching is not ambiguous about any of these. The Catechism is explicit. Deuteronomy is explicit. These are not neutral entertainment. They are acts of seeking knowledge or power from a source that is not God. And in the Church's theological framework, there is no neutral third category. There is God, and there is what is not God. Every soul that has participated in these practices, even casually, even once, even as a teenager who did not know better, has extended an invitation, however unwitting, through a door that they may not have known how to close. The second is habitual sexual sin, particularly pornography. I teach this with precision and without apology. Human sexuality in its proper context within marriage, ordered toward life and union, is a participation in God's creative power. It is sacred in the original sense of that word. The demonic exploits the sacred precisely because it was designed to be sacred. A soul habituated to grave sexual sin, a soul that returns again and again to material that degrades the image of God in another person, has weakened its spiritual defenses in a specific and theologically documented way. I have seen this pattern in more cases than I can number. The third is unforgiveness. Not the emotion of anger, which is not a sin, the act of the will that refuses to forgive, that holds the injury as a possession, that has decided in whatever corner of the heart the decision lives, that this person will not be forgiven. Aquinas is clear that when the will holds itself in a state contrary to charity, it holds itself in a state of separation from God. And in that separation, there is a legal structure the demonic uses. I have seen it operate in that register many times. The fourth is generational. Covenants formal or informal, made by ancestors that persist through family lines until they are broken by proper spiritual authority. Freemasonry initiations with their explicit oaths and their invocation of entities that are not the God of Christian revelation, occult practice in an earlier generation that was never renounced, blood pacts. These are not superstition. They are part of what Ripperger has addressed publicly in his teaching on generational spirits. And the church's tradition, going back to the book of Exodus, acknowledges that the sins of fathers can have consequences that reach into subsequent generations. Most people who come to me are not wicked people. They are often good people. People who love their families, who go to Mass, who try to live decent lives. But somewhere in their history, or in the history of those who came before them, a door was opened and no one knew how to close it. Now I want to speak about the weapons, because this is where the tradition is absolutely clear, and this is where the post-conciliar catechesis has done the most damage by treating these weapons as optional, as supplementary, as one spiritual lifestyle choice among many. They are not. They are the strategy. There is no other strategy. There is no workaround. The Eucharist, the body, blood, soul, and divinity of Jesus Christ, present under the appearances of bread and wine on every Catholic altar in the world and every valid Mass, not a symbol. Not a meal of fellowship that evokes the Last Supper. The actual, real, personal presence of the second person of the Holy Trinity. I have taught for years, based on what I have witnessed in deliverance ministry, that the demonic reacts to a consecrated host in a ciborium, completely covered, completely concealed from sight, with the same involuntary terror as to a host fully exposed in a monstrance. Because the enemy is not deceived by appearances. He cannot be. His angelic intellect penetrates appearances and knows what is really there. And what is really there on that altar at every valid Mass is the thing he hates above everything else in the created order, the incarnate Son, the one whose death he thought was his victory and who rose on the third day and has not stopped acting in the world since. The demonic reaction to the Eucharist is not superstition or folklore. It is an observable, documented, theologically coherent reality. This is why the attack on Mass attendance matters. This is why the soul that stops going to Mass, or goes to Mass but sleeps through the consecration, or goes through the physical motions without any interior engagement, has handed the enemy exactly what he wants. Not absence from a church building, absence from the greatest source of grace in the created order. That is the victory he is after. Confession. I want to be precise about what confession is, because the post-conciliar understanding of the sacrament has reduced it in many Catholics' minds to something therapeutic, something psychological, a process of naming your sins and feeling better about yourself. That is not what confession is. Confession is the actual, real, supernatural forgiveness of sins through the authority Christ gave to the apostles on Easter evening, recorded in the 20th chapter of John, verse 23. Whose sins you forgive, they are forgiven them. Not declared forgiven, not therapeutically processed, forgiven. The mechanism by which the legal hold of unconfessed grave sin over a soul is broken. Broken formally, broken by divine authority in a way that the demonic has no choice but to acknowledge. I have stood in rooms and watched the result of a formal general confession in a person who had carried unconfessed grave sin for decades. The change is not subtle. The enemy does not simply depart politely. But the authority is real, and it operates the sacramentals. Properly blessed holy water, not simply water with a prayer said over it by anyone who feels called to bless it, but water that has been exorcised and blessed by a priest using the proper formulae of the Roman ritual. The brown scapular of Our Lady of Mount Carmel, with its promise that the soul who dies wearing it will not suffer eternal fire, blessed crucifixes, exorcised salt, exorcised oil, the rosary. These are not superstition. They are physical matter set apart by the Church's authority through which grace operates, because we are embodied creatures and God has chosen to operate through the material order from the moment He took flesh in the womb of a virgin. The brass holy water font outside a sacristy is not decoration. It is a spiritual boundary marker. The crucifix on the wall is not art. It is a declaration of whose house this is. The rosary. I have spoken about this in many contexts, and I will say it again here. I have seen possession cases brought to their knees by the rosary. Not by shouting at the demon, not by dramatic confrontation, but by the sustained, quiet, faithful completion of the rosary by people in that room who were in a state of grace and meant what they were saying. I have heard in the course of the rite, under the compulsion of the rite, responses that I will not repeat in detail, but that confirmed what the tradition has always maintained. The demon fears the rosary precisely because it is the prayer of the Mother of God, and she is the one whose heel was promised in Genesis 3, verse 15, to crush his head. That is not poetry, that is prophecy, and it has been operating in the world since the moment it was spoken. Now, I need to speak about the cultural dimension because the individual cases do not exist in isolation, and the Church's public teaching has addressed this, and I want to be faithful to it. The rate of severe demonic cases has been rising. Every serious exorcist I have spoken with in the course of my ministry has observed this. The question is why, and the answer is not mysterious. It is the systematic dismantling over the course of 60 years of the spiritual infrastructure that protected the West. The Second Vatican Council opened in 1962 and closed in 1965. I am not attacking the Council. The Council was a legitimate act of the Church's teaching authority and is not the subject of this video. What I am addressing is what happened in its aftermath in the practical formation of Catholics. The generation of Catholics who came through religious education in the 1970s and 1980s was, in many cases, not taught the real presence, was not taught the gravity of mortal sin, was not taught the nature of the demonic. A Pew Research survey conducted in 2019 found that only 31% of Catholics who attend Mass weekly believe the Eucharist is the actual body and blood of Christ. 69% believe it is only a symbol. This is not a theological abstraction. This is a catastrophe. A soul that does not believe in the real presence does not bring the defenses of belief to the most important spiritual encounter available to it each week. It arrives at Mass at an enormous disadvantage. Seminary formation through the 1970s and into the 1990s in many American and European institutions treated the demonic as metaphor, as psychological projection, as pre-scientific language for what we now understand as mental illness. I have spent years in this ministry cleaning up that catechesis. Priests who had been ordained for decades and had never been told that the solemn rite of exorcism existed. Priests who, when confronted with genuine possession cases, had no theological category for what they were seeing and referred the person to a psychiatrist and called it a day. I do not blame those priests. I blame the formation they received. The revised rite of exorcism issued in 1999 requires, in practice, episcopal permission that many bishops are reluctant to grant. The practical result in many dioceses is that a priest who wishes to perform a solemn exorcism faces administrative and canonical obstacles that effectively delay intervention. I have addressed this in my public teaching, and I will address it again here. The 1614 Roman ritual remains a valid liturgical rite of the Church, and the tradition that flows from it is not something any administrative structure can erase. The collapse of sacramental confession and post-conciliar practice is documented. The average Catholic confession rate has dropped precipitously since the mid-1960s. In many parishes, the confessional is open for 30 minutes a week and empty during most of that time. The legal hold of unconfessed grave sin over souls is accumulating, and the demonic operates in that accumulation. The assault on the family, the contraceptive culture, no-fault divorce legislation beginning with California in 1969, the progressive redefinition of marriage and sexuality, the targeting of children through educational systems and media has systematically dismantled the natural institution through which faith was transmitted from generation to generation. The family is the domestic church. When the domestic church is broken, the children growing up in the ruins have no armor. They arrive at adulthood spiritually naked in a world that has never been more hostile. I am not telling you everything in the modern world is demonically inspired. I am not asking you to read a conspiracy into every cultural development